The smell of beans simmering over the small iron stove curled through the cabin, filling the air with the humble promise of supper. Outside, the plains stretched wide and indifferent, the late light slipping across the grass like a hand brushing an old scar. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone used to solitude, spoon stirring, shoulders bent just slightly forward, as though even the air had pressed her into resignation. The creak of the floorboards beneath her bare feet was the only company she had most evenings. That, and the occasional low murmur of cattle drifting in from the far field. A sound broke the stillness, faint, hesitant. She stilled, spoon in hand. Not the groan of wood or the scrape of wind. It was softer, almost not there at all, the hush of two small voices carrying through the dusk. She frowned, heart tightening without permission, and stepped toward the door. Another whisper, higher now, caught on the air like a fragile thread. We've been walking without shoes for 2 days, just to find a piece of bread. Her hand hovered above the latch. For an instant, she felt as though the whole house leaned forward with her, listening. When she pulled the door open, the scene before her cut deeper than any blade could. 2 little girls stood barefoot in the dust. Their dresses clung limp with sweat and dirt, their faces pale beneath streaks of grime. One clutched the other's hand, both eyes wide, hollow, waiting as though the world itself might shut them out again. She froze. The heat of the stove pressed against her back, the sight of them burning through the fragile shell she had built around herself. She had grown used to quiet, used to no one knocking, no one calling her name. She had trained her heart to survive on absence. But here, at her threshold, stood absence given shape, 2 children who looked as though they had run out of every ounce of belonging. The older of the 2, though she could not have been more than 5, raised her chin, voice cracked but steady. "Please, ma'am. Just bread." The woman's throat tightened. For a moment, she could not answer. She remembered a preacher's words spoken long ago, drifting back as if carried on the smoke of memory. "Whosoever shall give a cup of cold water to one of these little ones shall not lose their reward." Her own hands trembled at her sides. "I don't have much," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. "But you'll come in. Both of you." The girls exchanged a glance, the kind of look too old for their years, as if weighing the risk of trust. Then, silently, they stepped inside. The cabin was plain, bare shelves, rough-hewn table, a cot against the wall. The warmth of the stove wrapped around them, and the smell of beans seemed to slow their breathing. The younger one sank onto the floor by the fire without asking, exhaustion overtaking her. The elder kept standing, though her knees quivered. The woman moved quickly now, ladling beans into wooden bowls, tearing what remained of her bread loaf. She set it before them, watching as their small hands shook, then steadied, then moved with fierce hunger. They ate without sound, except for the scrape of spoons and the quiet sighs that seemed to slip from their bones. As she watched, she felt an ache bloom in her chest, sharp, unfamiliar. Loneliness she knew well. It had been her companion for years. But this was something else. It was the weight of responsibility pressing onto her shoulders, unasked but undeniable. These children had found her door. That could not be undone. She crouched beside them, her voice softer now. "Where's your kin?" The elder paused, spoon hovering midair. Her eyes lowered. "Mama's gone. A year ago." She swallowed, forcing the rest. "Ain't nobody else." The words struck with a finality that left the room still. Gone. Just like that. She knew death's reach, had watched neighbors lowered into the ground, had heard the hush fall over towns when sickness came. But to see its shadow in a child's eyes was something else entirely. The woman pressed her palm against the rough wood of the floor, grounding herself. She wanted to say something, anything to soften what had already hardened in their young lives. But she had no words, only actions. She rose, fetched a basin, filled it with warm water. One by one, she lifted their feet, washing away the dust and cuts. Their small toes curled at the touch, not used to gentleness. They did not speak again, only leaned toward the fire, eyes fluttering with the pull of sleep. She covered them with the old quilt that had once been hers as a girl, worn thin but still holding warmth. The cabin settled into silence, broken only by the crackle of flames. She sat at the table, staring at her empty bowl, listening to the sound of their breathing. Outside, the plains stretched wide and endless. Inside, her world had narrowed to two small chests rising and falling beneath her quilt. Her life had been carved by solitude, shaped by whispers of judgment from townfolk who said she was strange, unwanted, destined to grow old alone. She had accepted it, even believed it. But tonight, as the firelight flickered across the sleeping faces of two children who had come to her door with nothing but hunger and hope, she felt something shift inside her. She did not yet know what it meant, or how it would end. But as the wind rattled the shutters, she knew this much: she could not turn them away. And when the knock came at the door, sharp and sudden, she knew the world would not let her keep them without a fight. Morning light broke gently across the plains, soft as spilled milk, seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. She stirred from restless sleep, the memory of last night's knock still echoing in her bones. Whoever had rapped upon her door had left no trace. When she rose in the darkness, there had been nothing but wind pressing at the shutters. Now, as she stood by the stove and coaxed the fire back to life, she glanced toward the corner where the two girls still lay under her quilt. Their breathing was slow, steady, their small faces less drawn, though the shadows of hunger and grief remained etched into their features. She ladled a bit of cornmeal into the pot, stirring with a wooden spoon, and felt again that strange ache settle in her chest. She had expected them to vanish with the dawn, figments of her solitude conjured from smoke and loneliness. But there they were, two small bodies curled in the hush of her home, as real and fragile as the fire that now caught on kindling. The elder girl stirred first, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. Her hair, matted and uncombed, fell in strands across her face. She looked around as if reminding herself this was not another night under the sky. Then her eyes found the woman, and she spoke in a voice still hoarse from thirst. "We didn't mean to trouble you, ma'am. We can go if you want." The words stung. That children so small should already learn to apologize for their existence felt like a cruelty deeper than hunger. The woman shook her head, sliding the pot from the flames. "You'll eat first. No one goes hungry out of this house. Not while I've got breath in me." The girl's eyes flickered, caught between disbelief and the faintest thread of trust. The younger one woke next, still drowsy, and leaned heavily against her sister as they came to the table. Their small hands cupped the warm bowls as if holding treasure, and they ate in silence, as though to speak might snatch it away. As the morning wore on, words began to come. Haltingly, through mouthfuls and pauses, their story spilled in pieces. Their mother had died the winter before, fever taking her quick and merciless. She had been buried in a shallow grave beyond the river, wrapped in the only quilt she had left. The girls had stayed with a neighbor for a time, but kindness wears thin when bellies are empty. They were passed from one weary hand to another, until at last they drifted loose, wandering roads, sleeping beneath trees, learning quickly which houses turned them away before they could knock. The woman listened, each fragment of their tale laying its weight upon her shoulders. She knew too well the shape of abandonment, though hers had been quieter, stretched over years. She had lived in this cabin since she was 19, when her parents' debts had been paid by selling her to the land itself. Suitors had come, some with laughter, some with rough hands, none with gentleness. The town had labeled her barren long before her womb had even been tested, whispers carrying like wind through wheat. Eventually, folk stopped asking, and she grew into silence, her worth measured only in her ability to mend fences and coax beans from the soil. She studied the children as they helped her with small chores, fetching kindling, scattering feed for the hens. They moved with a guarded obedience, as though any misstep might cost them their place. When the younger girl slipped on the path and fell, she froze before she cried, waiting to see if kindness or cruelty would follow. The woman knelt, brushing dust from the child's scraped knee. "You're safe here," she said softly, though her voice caught on the truth she had yet to decide. Safe, yes, but for how long? That afternoon, as the sun pressed heat into the earth, she recalled words a trader had once shared while waiting for his horse to be shod: "The best among you are those who are best to the orphan." She had thought little of it then, dismissing it as another man's creed. But now, with two faces looking to her for bread, those words stirred like embers in her heart. When evening came, they sat together at the table, 3 bowls, 3 shadows stretched long on the wall. The elder girl whispered a small prayer before eating, lips moving around words too soft to catch. The woman lowered her eyes, humbled by the faith still burning in such weary souls. Yet beneath the fragile peace, a new fear stirred. She thought of the town, of the eyes that had always lingered too long, searching for fault. What would they say now, seeing her with children not her own? Some would call it charity, others foolishness. Many would whisper worse, that she had stolen them, that she could not bear her own and so claimed another's. That night, long after the girls had drifted into sleep, she sat by the fire, staring at the flickering coals. She traced the worn edge of the quilt that covered them, remembering her mother's hands stitching it when she herself was just a child. She thought of how easily lives could vanish. Her parents, their debts, these girls' mother. Ashes scattered on the wind, leaving only what one chose to hold. A choice, that was what it came down to. She had lived years without being chosen, without choosing anything beyond survival. Now, 2 small lives had walked barefoot to her door, asking for bread. And she knew, deep in her chest, that bread would not be enough. As she rose to douse the fire, a sound drifted faint through the window. Hoofbeats, steady and unhurried, moving along the road. She froze, listening. The rhythm grew louder, then slowed near her gate. A shadow shifted against the pale light of the moon, a figure on horseback lingering where her land met the world beyond. The girls stirred in their sleep, unaware. The woman's hand clenched at her side, heart hammering. Whoever it was, they had come in the night, and she could not yet tell if it was help or harm drawing breath at her fence line. The girls clung to her skirts as the wagon wheels rattled past, the town unfolding like a stage set against the pale morning sky. Dust rose in little clouds, carrying with it the mixed scents of leather, hay, and coal smoke. She had not walked these streets in months, maybe longer. Now every glance seemed sharper, every whisper more piercing, as though her presence drew judgment the way a flame pulled moths. The children's bare feet left smudges of dust on the boardwalk, and she felt their trembling through the fabric of her dress. A shopkeeper paused in sweeping his stoop, eyes narrowing at the sight of them. "Strays," he muttered under his breath, not softly enough. Another woman, bonnet pulled low, clutched her basket closer. It was as if the girls' hunger, visible in their thin arms, threatened to spill contagion onto anyone who looked too long. She guided them into the general store, keeping her chin steady though her heart pounded. The bell above the door clanged, sharp in the quiet. Behind the counter, the storekeeper, round-bellied, red-faced, fixed her with a gaze that flickered briefly to the children before settling into a frown. "I'll need flour," she said, setting her coins carefully on the counter. "And soap. Maybe a strip of calico, if you've any left." He eyed the money, then the girls. "Can't extend credit, not these days," he said, though she had not asked. His hand lingered on the coins as if debating whether to touch them at all. She forced herself to meet his eyes, her voice low but steady. "I pay for what I take." The eldest girl tugged gently at her sleeve, whispering, "It's all right, ma'am. We don't need the cloth." Her words, meant to ease, cut her deeper than the shopkeeper's scorn. She pressed her hand over the child's, firm. "You'll have it." The man finally swept the coins into his palm, muttering, "Charity has its place. But folk talk when things don't look right." His meaning hung heavy, sour in the air. She gathered the bundle without reply, but as she stepped back into the sunlit street, the weight of unseen eyes pressed on her shoulders. At the far end of town, a voice rose above the hum of gossip. A preacher's wife, stern-faced and sharp-tongued, stood with 2 other women. "It ain't proper," she declared, gaze fixed on the children. "A woman alone, keeping young ones not her own. There are homes that can take them. Better places." The words reached her ears, though spoken as if she were deaf. The girls shrank against her sides, one burying her face in her apron. Heat climbed her neck, but she walked on, steps slow and deliberate, as though every board beneath her feet might splinter if she faltered. She felt the sting of shame rise, but beneath it something else smoldered, a fierce protectiveness new and startling. She had endured whispers before, had grown accustomed to them gnawing at the edges of her life. But never had the whispers struck at someone smaller than herself. Outside the smithy, a man leaned on the post, broad-shouldered, quiet-eyed. His hat shaded his face, but she recognized him, a neighboring rancher widower known more for silence than speech. He watched her a moment, then stepped forward, offering a small burlap sack. "Flour," he said simply. His voice was low, steady, unadorned. She shook her head, pride rising before she could stop it. "I can manage." He studied her, gaze neither pitying nor hard, only patient. Then he set the sack at her feet without another word, tipped his hat, and turned back toward his horse. The girls stared after him, wide-eyed, as if they had witnessed a miracle. That night, back at the cabin, she unfolded the calico. Its faded red pattern seemed almost too fine for the rough walls around her. The elder girl touched the fabric with reverence. "It's the prettiest thing I ever had," she whispered. Her drawing, scratched onto scrap paper with a stub of pencil she found, showed 3 figures holding hands beneath a roof. The sight of it struck the woman like a blow, both tender and devastating. They had placed her within their small vision of a home. Yet as the firelight danced, she heard again the preacher's wife's words, and the shopkeeper's mutter. "Charity has its place. Better homes. Folk talk." She stared at the girls sleeping under her quilt, their breaths soft, even. And she knew the town would not leave her be. The knock at her door came late, long after the flames had burned low. A slow, deliberate rap, followed by silence. She rose, heart hammering, and for the first time wondered not who might be on the other side, but whether they had come to take the children away. The storm announced itself with a low growl on the horizon, a warning that seemed to tremble through the soil before the first raindrop fell. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and wind whipped across the plains in restless sweeps. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the clouds roll in heavy and thick, the girls pressed against her skirts. The youngest asked in a trembling voice if the sky was breaking. The woman pulled her close, murmuring, "No, child. Just the Lord clearing his throat." But even as she said it, her own chest tightened with unease. The rain came sudden and hard, drumming on the cabin roof with a fury that seemed meant to test more than wood and nails. Water ran in rivulets across the packed dirt, turning the yard into a shallow sea. She hurried the children inside, bolting the door, feeding more wood to the fire. The cabin held firm, but the wind moaned against it like a restless spirit. Lightning split the sky, bleaching the room in white before plunging it back into shadow. It was during that long stretch of thunder and rain that the younger girl's cough began. At first it was faint, just a tickle in her throat. But as the hours wore on, it deepened, rattling her small chest, leaving her cheeks flushed and her breaths uneven. Panic clawed at the woman's stomach. She pressed her palm to the child's forehead and felt the fire of fever rising. She tried everything she knew. Cool cloths pressed to the girl's skin, sips of water coaxed past her lips, whispered lullabies from her own childhood. The older sister hovered, wide-eyed, fear thick in her silence. "Will she die too?" she whispered at last, voice breaking like glass. The words struck like a lash, pulling the woman back to the small grave beyond the river that the girls had spoken of. She gripped the child's shoulders, steadying her. "No, not while I draw breath. I won't let her go." But even as she said it, she felt the helplessness claw deeper. The storm cut them off from town, the road already swallowed by water. The fever raged on, her remedies no more than whispers against a rising tide. At the bedside she knelt, voice low, words spilling like a confession. "Lord, I've got nothing but these hands. Don't let me fail them. Don't let me lose them the way the world has taken everything else." The night stretched mercilessly, every hour marked by the ragged cough, every crack of thunder shaking the cabin. Exhaustion bent her shoulders, yet she would not leave the child's side. When at last a sharp knock sounded against the door, she thought at first it was the storm playing tricks. But then it came again, steady, insistent. She opened the door to find the widowed rancher, rain streaming from his hat, his horse tethered nearby. In one hand he held a leather satchel, in the other a lantern shielded against the wind. His eyes met hers without hesitation. "Heard you might need this." She stepped back wordlessly, and he entered, setting the lantern on the table. From his satchel he drew out bottles and cloth, medicines carefully wrapped. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, carrying the calm weight of someone who had faced storms before. He knelt at the child's side, murmuring a few quiet words as he examined her, then set to work preparing a remedy. The older girl watched him with cautious hope, while the woman felt a different tremor within her, relief so fierce it nearly undid her, laced with the unfamiliar sensation of trust. She busied herself fetching water, holding the lamp steady, anything to keep her hands from shaking. Through the long hours they worked together, keeping vigil by the fire. At times silence held them, broken only by the child's uneven breathing. At others, he spoke in low tones, recalling a verse he had once heard a preacher recite, "Love is patient, love is kind. It bears all things, believes all things, endures all things." The words settled into the air like a balm, not loud, not forced, simply present. When exhaustion threatened to topple her, she felt his hand brush lightly against her shoulder. "Rest a moment," he said. "I'll keep watch." She shook her head, unwilling to surrender even an instant. Yet his presence steadied her, and in that small cabin lit only by fire and storm, something fragile began to form, a bond not of grand gestures, but of shared burden. Toward dawn, the fever finally broke. The child's breathing eased, her small body slackening into true sleep. The woman bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her face. The rancher exhaled as if he, too, had been holding his breath all night. Outside, the storm began to pass, clouds thinning, light edging across the horizon. The world, though battered, endured. Inside, the cabin felt altered, as though its walls had witnessed something binding, something that could not easily be undone. The woman looked at him then, really looked, the lines of weather on his face, the quiet steadiness of his eyes, the way he seemed both part of the storm and apart from it. Gratitude swelled in her, mingled with a fear just as sharp, that needing someone might make her vulnerable in ways she had long avoided. As he gathered his satchel, preparing to leave with the first clear light, she felt the weight of choice pressing again upon her heart. The children had bound themselves to her without words, and now this man, by simple presence, had begun to stitch himself into their fragile circle. She followed him to the porch, where water still pooled in low places, the air heavy with the scent of rain. He paused before mounting his horse, glancing back at her. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the dripping eaves. "Storm's not the only thing coming." And with that, he rode away, leaving her clutching the doorframe, the warning echoing in her chest like the last rumble of thunder. Sunday dawned pale and sharp, the air washed clean by the storm. The town's church bell tolled across the valley, its echo carrying over the wet earth and the mended fences, summoning the faithful to gather. She rose early, brushed her hair smooth though her hands trembled, and dressed the girls in calico patched with care. Their faces were freshly washed, their braids tied with frayed ribbon, and though their dresses were worn, they stood in the doorway as if clothed in something finer, hope itself. She knew what awaited them in town. The whispers had thickened like smoke since the storm. Neighbors, once content to let her solitude stand, had begun questioning aloud whether she had any right to keep the children. Some called it charity gone astray, others muttered of impropriety, of secrets hidden in her cabin. The preacher's wife, stern as an iron rod, had spoken openly of placing the girls with families more proper, more capable. Yet as she tied the girls' hands together with a thin cord of twine, not as a restraint but as a promise they would not be parted, she felt resolve rise steady as the bells toll. They walked the muddy road into town, boots and bare feet alike splashing through puddles. Heads turned as they passed, some curious, some pitying, some sharp with judgment. Yet she held her chin high, one child on either side, and for the first time in years, she did not shrink from the eyes upon her. Inside the church, the air smelled of damp wood and lamp oil. The congregation turned as she entered, their gaze settling like a weight across her back. The girls clung close, and she guided them down the aisle, her steps deliberate, every creak of the floorboards a declaration. We belong here too. She could feel the preacher's wife staring, lips pursed, already shaping words meant to wound. Midway through the service, as the hymn faded and silence settled thick, the youngest girl reached for her hand. Her small palm, warm and certain, slid into hers, anchoring her to the moment. The elder followed, slipping her other hand into her sister's, until the three of them were bound in a chain across the pew. The simple touch carried more weight than any sermon, more power than any decree. In that fragile clasp, the woman felt herself chosen, claimed not by society, but by two small souls who had decided she was enough. Across the aisle, she caught sight of the rancher. He stood steady among the men, hat in his hands, his gaze fixed not on the preacher but on her. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, only a quiet strength, as if he meant to lend her his shoulders without asking anything in return. She felt the steadiness of his presence, like the post of a fence driven deep into earth, unshaken by wind. The preacher spoke of storms and endurance, of Noah's Ark and the promise of rainbows, but his words drifted over her like river water. What mattered was the warmth of the girls beside her, the truth of their touch, and the silent vow rising in her chest. When the final prayer ended, she rose with them, walked past the curious faces, and stepped into the sunlight without faltering. Outside, the murmurs resumed, but they carried a different note. Some softened their gaze, others held fast to suspicion. Yet when the family returned home, they found a loaf of bread waiting on the porch, wrapped in cloth, still warm. Later that week, a quilt appeared, folded neatly on the gatepost. The town, in its contradictory way, had begun to shift, not in unanimous approval, but in reluctant recognition. That night, as they sat at the table, beans simmering in the pot, the girls laughed for the first time since they had arrived. Their laughter was light, unburdened, the kind that fluttered like birds across the rafters. The woman watched them with a quiet ache, knowing joy and fear often traveled side by side. She turned her gaze to the neighbor, who had joined them unasked, his plate balanced in his hands. He spoke little, only offering now and again a story of cattle or weather. Yet when one girl leaned her head against his arm as though it were the most natural thing, he did not flinch. His eyes flickered toward the woman, and in their silence a question lingered, though no words were spoken. After supper, as the fire burned low, she sat back and let the moment sink into her bones. It was not grandeur, not triumph, not the loud blessing of the town. It was something smaller, deeper, bread shared across a wooden table, a hand resting unnoticed until the touch felt like home, shadows cast on the wall that made for where once there had been one. Outside, the wind sighed against the shutters, carrying with it the echoes of the town's gossip and doubt. But inside, warmth radiated from the simple scene, binding them together in ways no decree could sever. She thought of the preacher's words, of the storm's warning, of all the years she had lived believing she was unworthy of belonging. And then she looked at the girls, their eyes closing in trust, their breath steady, and she knew the truth. Homes were not built from approval, nor from bloodlines. They were built from the smallest offerings, bread torn and shared, a quilt tucked close, the quiet endurance of love unspoken. And as she watched the rancher glance at her when he thought she wasn't looking, she felt the truth seal itself in her chest, heavy and certain. Whatever storm still lay ahead, they had already found their ark. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.